Overrepresentation, yesterday and today. Overrepresentation is defined as a disproportionate number of students who belong to a specific racial or ethnic group being categorized as in need of special education. When this support of special education first began, the statistics at that time showed that any specific group of students should not be represented at a level higher than 7 to 11%. And yet in many of today's urban areas, we have low socioeconomic students who are non-white that are represented at levels as high as 50%. The formalization of the special education categorization structure that we have today began with PL 1942, which was passed in 1975, and then it was again renamed, reauthorized and renamed the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, in 1990 and 1997. This act again formalized special education structures and the way that kids are labeled in need of special education, and it had created some specific challenges for students who were non-white, low socioeconomic status, and one of these groups is American Indian and Alaska Natives. As you can see, the statistics for American Indian and Alaska Native students as far as being labeled in need of special education are pretty alarming. The only other group of students that is labeled at a higher level are African American students, specifically African American males. And to begin the history of overrepresentation, Christine Sleeter talks about soft labels. There's what we call in special education are soft labels and hard labels. And hard labels are labels that you really have some firm sort of medical criteria behind the label. Down syndrome, things such as that, where you really have a specific set of characteristics that show that this disability exists. Soft labels like learning disabilities, emotionally disturbed, and cognitive disabilities are called soft because their definitions are completely ambiguous. There is no real medical criteria that goes along with these labels. They differ across state lines. In fact, I had a student one time that over a 3-month period was labeled learning disabled, mentally retarded, regular ed, and then learning disabled again, because the state of Wisconsin at the time was revamping its criteria for LD, and there was a psychologist on the IEP team that wanted to use only IQ score as the predictor of what category the student fit into. So the questions that are still left unanswered are, we know so much about disproportionality and overrepresentation of non-white, low socioeconomic students, and yet the numbers keep rising. And the question really is why is there even still such a phenomena? Why haven't we created structural changes, true structural changes that will take care of this? Because we can, but what I'd like to focus on is why do Native American and Native Alaskan students continue to be overrepresented, and how can this be rectified? One possible cause for overrepresentation, as we've talked about and read about in some of our articles through class, is curriculum. Banks and Banks state that there is this official set of valued knowledge, and that this set continues trends of inequity. When you are a student, specifically a Native American or a Native Alaskan student, and you come to the educational table with a different set of educational values and experiences and background knowledge, you are already at a disadvantage before you even walk into the school. And when you are then assessed on this particular official set of knowledge, it creates even more problems for you, specifically since many of the standardized assessment tools that we use are normed on white middle-class students. In fact, the Burroughs Mental Measurement Yearbook, which is sort of the Bible of the reliability and validity of testing materials, specifically standardized, states that many of these standardized tests and IQ tests that we use should be used with caution when used on groups that are outside of the norm, the testing norms. The WISC and the WISC-3 in particular have always, if you look at Burroughs, have a reliability and validity issues, especially when they are used as the sole predictor for a student for special education. And as Bordeaux stated, that these psychometric tests should be limited when assessing the UPIC and the Navajo. I have seen these tests used in ways in which Burroughs states it is just absolutely inappropriate to use them as a sole indicator, and yet the IQ test is really heavily relied upon within any type of in need of special education team meeting when you're trying to make that diagnosis or define where that student fits into the special education categories. Another problem is learning styles. As we've talked about in class, American Indian and American Native students come to school exhibiting a field-dependent model learning style. They have a more reflective learning style, and they have come to the table with perpetual strengths, which are visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. This is the antithesis to the skills and the learning styles that are taught within a traditional Eurocentric classroom. They also create big problems since many times, again, the tests and things all reflect this Eurocentric type of learning style also. I had was part of an action research that we did one time in a school that I worked at in Milwaukee, and we looked at basically classroom A, B, and C, and all we did was look at over a 5-year period how many special education referrals came out of classroom A, classroom B, and classroom C. Well, there was an overwhelming 50% more, actually, special ed referrals came out of classroom C. And then when we further investigated that and did some teacher interviews and things such as that, we saw that these classroom A, this teacher had a much sort of smaller box that she expected students to sort of fit into. She had very, very traditional ideals of what the student should be exhibiting within the classroom, and this definitely led to a higher level of special education referrals. Then bias is the last thing, and bias you can find before, after, and during the special education categorization process. Before, in pre-assessments, again, if you have a teacher that has a very narrow box in which he or she expects students to behave and or exhibit knowledge, there's going to be a higher level of special ed referral within that class. During, there's testing bias, the testing bias that we've already talked about, but also the tester can come in and have, you know, some really significant bias about the student that he or she is testing, and that also creates issues within the testing environment. And then after, another large problem is that we like to go to IEP meetings and talk about how these supports that we are going to have for students, and yet what we notice in many districts is there's actually a flatlining that takes place when kids are labeled special education. Now again, I'm not talking about kids who have hard labels. These are all the soft label students, and the soft label students flatline. So what can we do? Well, we can continue with early intervention, but we have to pair this intervention with culturally and linguistic forms of interventions that are relevant and tailored to the unique needs of whatever population it is that we're dealing with. Without that, we're just, again, teaching more Eurocentric behaviors. Tippecanoe also talks about how we need to bring the community, the Native community, into the equation. Basically, we have to have the right people at the table. There has to be tribal control of education. There has to be a focus and a priority on the education of American and American Native students, a continued commitment to moving away from this deficit assimilation approach, which special education is rooted in the deficit assimilation approach. We need to go beyond this. And then again, as we've talked about in class, the research that we do needs to really be a true partner with the American Indian, American Native, Alaskan Native community. My 2 cents, the educators need to reflect on their own bias, educational bias and societal bias to truly create structures that challenge overrepresentation. If we are going to decrease overrepresentation, we have got to listen to the communities that we serve, and we need to remember that we do serve these communities. We, as educators, need to not stop with the education of others, but we need to continually education ourselves, especially when the culture of the teacher and the student differ. It's absolutely imperative to reach all students. And finally, if teachers and other educational professionals begin to embrace all of these suggestions, I think that we can still believe that we can create schools where injustice is challenged, and we can decrease one of the forms of injustice that has been coined overrepresentation. Thanks for a great semester, and I hope that this time this works.